I'm really pleased and honored to present our second panel. Jordan Bennett, in the middle, is an exhibiting artist in ABADAKONE, Continuous Fire Feu Continuel, and his monumental and beautiful work, Tepkik, hangs above us here in the Great Hall. Alexandra Nabagawo is the Associate Curator of Historical Indigenous Art at the National Gallery of Canada, and Ira Wagman, next to me, is an Associate Professor of Communication and Media Studies and the Interim Associate Director in the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University. So I guess to start, I'll ask each of you just to take a few minutes to talk about yourselves, your work, and your interest in our theme this evening. I'll start with you, Ira.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. It's great to be here and great to be with you this evening. So tonight's, my remarks tonight draw on some research that I do studying media history and digital media and the relationship between media and time. I should also say that what I'm about to say is inspired by the fact that I'm inching closer towards the age of 50, which is a crisis age in time for me. So I would be lying if I didn't say that there was an element of time awareness under these circumstances. In addition, though, what I'm about to say is particularly inspired by some notes that I took when I was here last week to see the ABADAKONE exhibition, and particularly by Jordan Bennett's evocative installation that we're sitting under this evening. In looking up at Tepkik, featuring Mi'kmaq petroglyphs depicting the Milky Way, we should stop for a moment to consider how we appreciate the passing of time. Consider how we know that we are having an experience, or what marks the weekend off from other days in the week, or how we are in a different mood when we are on holidays, or when it's our birthday, when we are sick, or when we are in mourning. Let us pause, which is itself a kind of temporal break, to consider how our conception of time is mediated by the seasons, or by the clock, or by the light. Then we can think about how some of the values we have in mainstream society are themselves bound up with time. Think about how virtuous it is to be in a constant state of busyness, always being productive. Or think about how assessment of public transit, a touchy issue in this city, I realize, or healthcare is characterized by wait times, or delays, or canceled buses, or surgeries. The popular practice of mindfulness and meditation is itself a kind of time moment. Stop what you're doing, take a breath, hear the world around you, feel the world passing through you with each exhale. Could we not say that mindfulness is alter ego? Anxiety is indeed one of the key dispositions of the 21st century, linked in part to feelings of disequilibrium, of not having enough time to think, of being out of sorts, or of being concerned what tomorrow may bring. To this, we could also think about our ability to mark time through photographs, or memorials, or marks, or scars, or tattoos on our bodies, which themselves serve as the surface for the ways that the body experiences it. Think about terms that mark the experience of nations, of wars, of achievements and embarrassments of the colonizers and the colonized. A term like Anthropocene is now used to talk about the period where humans dominated the environment as we wrestle with how to address the biggest temporal issue of all right now, that of climate change. To be in a world, then, is to live in time, to be attentive to the tempo of daily existence and to the rhythms of duration, of delay, of transition, of repetition, and of remixing. Artists render time in fascinating ways, and very powerfully in some cases in the ABADAKONE exhibition, where they use various means to represent the passing of time, the preservation of individual or collective memory, the experience of the past, or to represent feelings of distraction or of disillusionment or simultaneity, or of the theft of individual experience, or the passing of traditions from generation to generation. In 2020, we might say that this experience of living in time has become an experience of living in the time of digital media. We know what we know of the world because it is brought to our attention on our phones or devices thanks to the algorithms that power social media and search engines. We cannot have an experience of something without taking a photo or a video of it. The popular phrase, pics or it didn't happen is a powerful statement on how media are not just devices that mediate or get in between us and our everyday experience of the world, but they are something that frames it. An experience is not an experience until we share it. We present versions of ourselves on sites like LinkedIn or Instagram that are curated and managed to present our best selves. Our sense of what it means to be bored, or to wait for something, or to go on a date, or to eat a meal, or to take a trip is now an experience that cannot be undertaken without a device to tell us where to go, what to say, or who to share it with. I have students who say that they announce major changes in their lives, new jobs, exciting trips, wedding engagements, at certain times of the day when they know they will be noticed by their friends and followers on their social media. We know full well that at the same time that we share moments with loved ones, we are also sharing our data with Facebook, who shares it with advertisers or governments, or which holds on to it themselves to do what they please as they seek our engagement. Amidst the incredible torrent of news and information coming to this, and against the backdrop of more and more invasive technologies predicting and prefiguring our actions, and given that it was us who agreed to this way of living in the first place, we must now start to think about how we should respond to it. What will be our ways of making the times of our lives feel like ours again? How will we experience solitude when there are pressures for us to respond to messages, to accept friend invitations, to answer the phone? How will we forgive people for things they have done on the internet that the internet saves and brings back to us without our permission? What's a memory where it's not preserved? It will be our responses to these questions, individually, collectively, creatively, that will tell us a lot about what constitutes our way of living in digitally mediated times. So maybe it should be right here under this beautiful installation, inviting us to consider our place in the galaxy where that conversation should begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Jordan, did you want to tell us a bit about your work and your thoughts about the theme?
What he said. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Walaliok, thank you all so much. To be here in this space is amazing in general, at the National Gallery in the Great Hall, but to have this piece is a huge honor. And I just had some family and friends come in the room, Mi'kmaq family and friends. So it's really great to have you all here underneath this piece, which is about home, and it's about our place as Mi'kmaq people in time and space, and to be gathered underneath of it. So this piece, like much of my practice, draws from the past to better place ourselves into the future. And through this work, by examining and spending time and visiting with Mi'kmaq cultural community objects and belongings, gives me time to reflect on time. Yeah. And to think about and to engage with makers from the past in a way that I wouldn't have the opportunity to do in any other way. I mean, a lot of these objects that I reference are porcupine quill designs that are about this big in general, sometimes this large. But when I get to visit with these works by these makers, I get to touch something that they touched. I get to connect with them over time, break our concepts of time, and really dive into their stories. Not what's embedded visually, just visually, but stories that were told around cups of tea at the kitchen table. All those emotions, all those stories, all those laughs, all those cries were embedded within these works. So what's really exciting for me to have this in a public space, not just in the gallery space, is that people do have access to this without having to go into the gallery to pay admission. And it gives people a chance to visit with this piece, to have their stories, to have their moments, to embed their laughter and their time and their Instagram stories into this piece. So yeah, for me, this is what I do is I make art. And I hope that it reaches people, and yeah, it's definitely got a little bit of a spread. You can see it from outside, which is pretty darn exciting.
I was going to say, when you drive by, it's just amazing just to look through at night and see it through the glass. Yeah. Alex, did you have some sort of initial thoughts about your work and the concepts that we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, so first I'll just say, Ani Kinawea, Gasanio Indigenous, Ottawa Donjaba, Mangan Dodem, Miigwechendam Mapi Gigatom. So my name is Alex, now Gabo. I'm Anishinaabe and Kanyagahaga, Wolf Clan, and a member of Whitefish River First Nation on Manitoulin Island. I grew up in Ottawa, and I've been at the gallery now for almost 2 years, so I still feel pretty new still, but I'm curator of historical Indigenous art. Time, thinking about this concept of time, I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to be able to talk to each other, to have this conversation. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate, and thank you to our guests for coming. So I'm trained as an art historian. I'm fascinated by time and how you can sort of travel through time through art and through objects. I think, Jordan and I have talked about this idea, he mentioned this idea of visiting with objects. And so the work that I do, I think when I started working with historical material culture made by Native people, at the time I was kind of dealing with how do I fit in? My brother and I were the first generation in our family to grow up off reserve. So I think I really struggled with this idea of belonging, or trying to figure out where I belong, and feeling, how do I feel that sense of connection to my community and where I come from. That it always existed in the family home, but outside of the family home, it was difficult, growing up in a predominantly white community. So when I first got access into things like museum collections, I could look at, a birch bark basket or a quill box or something, and I could see something that was just so brilliantly, expertly made from things that you would just find on the land. And I got so much pride out of that. And I really, I was super proud to come from a people that made things so beautifully. And so for me, thinking about time and being able to travel through time in museum collections, working with objects, has been a real personal journey for me. It's really meant, quite a lot to me. And I think also when we talk about visiting with objects, we want to spend a long time with these things, and we visit with them. It's not like, I think museum institutions that, kind of collected these things en masse, they were cataloged, and different surveys and things have looked at them in a very cursory, very survey kind of quick manner. But I think when Native people go in to look at these things, we want to spend a long time with them. You can spend hours with just one work, and you can learn so much from it. So I think when I think about time, that's what I think about and what resonates with me.
That's really interesting. I'm just thinking, as as an art educator, such a big part of our work is just to get people to spend some time, actually just stop and spend some time looking and thinking about a work of art. And it's not something that we do very much, which makes me think of, media and, social media and all that kind of stuff, Ira. In ABADAKONE, there's themes of relatedness, continuity, and activation are prominent throughout the exhibition. Mm-hmm. To what extent could we think about the capacities of media technologies using some of those terms?
Yeah. I think, the first thing that I think of with that question is, and again, I think in the exhibition, I think the contexts are in some ways very different. But I think that one of the things that media, both in the artistic sense but also in the technological sense, is that it has the capacity to place people in relationships, and in relationships across space. and in time. And so you can think of it in one sense like the triumph of public broadcasting of the CBC is to take all these people that are physically far apart and to kind of link them together and to have a kind of shared or simultaneous experience. But in another sense, I think what's interesting now, of course, is that now with developments like social media, what we have is a situation where your social group is now made up of a bunch of people who aren't physically in place, but are very much in time. That they are part of your social network, they're part of your experience. And so I think one of the things that media do is that they create various different kinds of relations between people and between people and things. And then one other quick point that I would make is that the other thing that one of the other fascinating functions about media technologies is their ability to produce presence, to make things present, to bring them either into your home or to bring them to the front or to bring someone from outside in, and that of course sometimes that's a good thing and that's something that we want, relatives, people from far away. Sometimes, as we know, that's also a bad thing, or that's a difficult thing, or a hard thing, or sometimes there are things which are present that you don't want to see, that other people want you to see. So I think I think what's so interesting about the exhibit is that it raises these kinds of questions, and then it asks you to think a little bit about these themes, both in terms of medium, in terms of the artistic sense, but then to think about the ways in which various kinds of media technologies exhibit those kinds of characteristics.
Thank you. Jordan, I get you touched on this already in your comments, but maybe you can talk a bit about time as a conceptual element in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mentioned, I do spend, and Alex brought it up too, is a lot of time with these community belongings, and you never have enough time when you're visiting these amazing, important pieces of your community. But the time that I do get, I really treasure it, and I try to take it from a lot of things from our communities that have been made historically are now in collections and museums, and a lot of them are being held in vaults, so they're locked in time, which is not what we want to do. So to be given the privilege to go into these vaults, into these collections, and it's getting easier. It hasn't been easy, but it's through folks like my dear friend Linda Grassani, who has helped to get me into vaults over across the way here in the Museum of Civilization, it was at one point. And to visit with these amazing, important cultural belongings has been the root to a lot of my work. So I get the privilege going there, but not everyone gets a chance going there. So what I do is I visit with these pieces, bring elements of them out, put them into artworks that can be accessed on social media, it can be accessed in the gallery, and the photos I take, even though I'm told I'm not allowed to share them, I share them with my community because it's ours. So allowing these pieces to really exist out of time in that way. Another way that I've been utilizing time and playing with time is I had an exhibition open in 2018 called Gadua Madajik, and it was an exhibition at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. And through connections through these different museums and building the trust up through these different museums over the years and working with other museums, I was able to borrow Mi'kmaq porcupine quill designs from different institutions across the country. And I didn't tell them what I was going to do with them, but they trusted me enough to just give them to me. So I said I wanted to interpret these pieces, incorporate these pieces into new artworks. So what I did is I embedded these porcupine quill designs on, mounted them to museum standards onto these backings, so these shaped panels, wooden panels. And what I did is I went into the museum, I put a piece of paper down, put the old quill work, between 100 and 400 years old, some of these pieces, and I traced the edges. I found the ends of where these designs stopped, where the makers only had that much time to create these works. another privilege I have is that I can continue these works. I can make works for now. I can just concentrate on making these works. But a lot of these porcupine quill designs were created by makers in our community, primarily women who were creating these porcupine quill designs on chair seat covers, baskets, lids for consumption through settlers that were coming into the community. So it was a way of income for our people. But at the same time, they're putting our imagery and our stories into these pieces still. So what I started to do with this piece, as I said, I was tracing it and continuing the lines, and I wanted to communicate over generations, to break this idea of time. So I started with this quill work, embedded it into the piece, did some painting around it, and extended that into the walls. The exhibition titled Gadu Almudajik means they want to go home in Mi'kmaq, roughly. And it was the first time that I was able to bring these community belongings back to Mi'kmaq territory, some of them in 200 years. So I wanted them to visit with one another. And I didn't lock them behind plexiglass. I put plexiglass in the front, I put the quill work, and the sides were open, so that way the air could pass through all of the works. Just up to enough standards that they let me do it. And because these belongings, they're not objects, they're living. They come from the earth, they belong to the earth, and they hold a spirit. So what was really great with the show is that I was able to communicate over the span of 200, 300, 400 years. But at the same time, I had visitors coming into the gallery, Mi'kmaq people, who recognized some of these pieces that weren't titled or didn't have a maker attributed to them. So this young woman came in, Melissa Peter Paul, who was a contemporary Mi'kmaq quill work artist, and she recognized it was her great-great-grandmother's quill work.
Oh, wow.
So I was able to take this piece from here, the bright pink one, the amazing bright pink one, and bring it to Nova Scotia for Melissa to visit with her grandmother.
Oh, wow.
I was able to help facilitate that. So breaking that time was really great, to say the least. It was friggin' awesome. And I continued to do that work to bring these objects back home in that kind of way. So, yeah, I love messing with time.
That's really interesting. I think I still kind of struggle to kind of not think about time as a linear kind of one-directional thing.
Absolutely.
But the way, what you just described kind of reminds me of what the in the previous panel, sort of a description of like the folding of time and of space, I guess, and things kind of coming together and coming apart. I guess that brings me to Alex. Maybe I'll ask you, maybe you can tell us a bit more about just how you've explored the concept of time in your curatorial practice. In doing my homework, I learned about temporal reimaginings, where the show you curated at Carleton University.
Canada Council.
Canada Council, I'm sorry. And you invited visitors to reimagine time through Indigenous art. And then I'm also thinking of the work that's happened here at the gallery, for example, in the Canadian and Indigenous galleries, where in the first room, works from different time periods come together. Could you tell us a little bit more about your curatorial practice?
Yeah, sure. First, I just wanted to touch on what these guys have talked about, just about social media and then objects. And you mentioned, being able to take pictures of things and put it on Facebook. Like, I can't tell you how many times, like on Facebook, like I'm friends with like different people in the museum world and people that are just interested in, makers and things. How often, like daily, I see posts, people, in collections, posting pictures, being like, hey, like, does anyone know, like, who made this, or what does this look like? And then there's this, whole, like, comment section of like, oh, that looks like Ottertail, I bet that's Anishinaabe. Like, oh, I don't know, I think that's this. So what I think, objects have a way of kind of shrinking these distances, temporal and like spatial distances, but the digital does that too, and being able to share things on social media. For people that may not get access to these things, or older folks maybe who have Facebook, but they aren't able to travel to, a certain museum collection. So anyway, I think, the digital makes a lot of really cool things super possible. So talking about my curatorial work, the show that I did at Canada Council, yeah, like I mentioned, I've always been really interested in this concept of time. But I was sort of inspired by it, or I really started thinking about it more. I went fishing with my dad and my uncles and my cousins on my reserve along Whitefish River, which is where our reserve gets its name. We went pickerel fishing, and it's right around where the pickerel spawn at a certain time of year. And we went there and we were all fishing, and my dad was telling me, like, you know, how important that site was because for fishing, and how it was a particular spot that makes it really easy. You know, you can really kind of get the fish, you know, in a certain way. And he was saying that, you know, when they were creating our reserve, the leaders at the time really wanted to make sure that that spot would be included in our traditional territory. Because, you know, people have been fishing there, our people have been fishing there for however many years. So I was thinking, like, man, like, how many members of my own family had done the same thing that I was doing, and even farther back, you know, how many different generations have been doing this. So when we talk about time being like multiplanar, or, you know, not even, yeah, like circular, not linear, something that can be kind of folded on top of itself, like over and over again. I like felt that in that moment, and I felt it many times, but in that moment it just felt super real. I was doing this exact same act in this exact same spot that, you know, my people have been doing for forever. So that was a very kind of interesting moment that I had, and so I wanted to explore that a bit more. And I couldn't really put into words what I was feeling. Like, it was like this very intangible kind of, like, how do I figure out how to talk about this? But then I noticed that, you know, a lot of Indigenous artists in particular are also kind of grappling with this feeling, like, how do we sort of talk about this feeling that we have when you kind of have this feeling of repetition, but not really. It's different, yet the same. And so I was looking at different ways that artists were doing that in that show. And then I've kind of continued to explore that while here in the Canadian Indigenous galleries, particularly in the first room. It's the only room in those galleries that have exclusively Indigenous art in them. And that was on purpose, because the theme of the new gallery space is from time immemorial to around the 60s, 70s. So I can't take credit for curating that space, opening in 2017. That was my brilliant colleague, Christine Lalonde. But I've taken over responsibility for that since I started here. But she had met with different advisory committees of Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks, and they had really wanted to make sure that one of the main themes that really came across was this idea of continuity, which is really different, I think. You know, I'm studying art history, Western art history. I think a lot of the time the things that get celebrated or are this idea of like rupture or like disruption, when things break from the past. That's when, like, you know, modernism begins. And whereas like in Indigenous art, it's about continuity. It's kind of, you know, if we borrow from the past or we're drawn from the past, it's not seen as something that's a bad thing. It's you know, we celebrate that. So in that space, we have very old works, so some ancient pieces together with contemporary work, Jordan's work in there being one of them, and Carolyn Monet also has a beautiful film in the side gallery. And so what we've also done, though, too, along with including historical and contemporary works together to really kind of show that idea of continuity and time folding in on itself, we've also included contemporary work that's made in like a customary, or what people would call a traditional material or technique, to really show that there are people that are still working in customary techniques and things, and they're artists, you know, they're highly skilled people who are making gorgeous work. Yeah, so we're really trying to kind of pull apart these stereotypes of Indigenous people being frozen in the past, or that because we draw from the past, that makes us not serious artists.
You're making me think about, I kind of talked about with you an experience I had, not that actually when the Canadian Indigenous galleries reopened, and how for a long time the Inuit art was in another gallery in another part of the building. And it was when I saw the Inuit art next to some of the paintings from the 60s from Quebec that I kind of realized, like I knew when the Inuit art had been made, but I really did think of it as something from far away or from longer ago than it was. And sort of seeing it kind of in that context kind of woke me up a little bit. So it's kind of, I'm very glad that that's the kind of practice that we're seeing in galleries. And you know, I've worked here for a long time, and so I think for our visitors it's really enlightening.
Yeah, I think keeping it not like segregated, because I think a lot of people don't envision, like work made by Inuit artists. They were making work at the same moment as the work by the, the Automatis. And so I think that is really refreshing to bring in, is to that, to show that Euro-Canadians and Indigenous people, we were all creating really meaningful work within the same moment at the same time and responding to a lot of the same things. And a lot of the time.
And just picking up on what you said sort of at the beginning, you were talking about sort of on social media, kind of the conversations that happen and the connections that happen through social media when people see works in the collection and share images of them. Kind of leads me to a question for you, Ira. Do you think that there are good things that come from the kinds of connectedness and immediacy that digital technologies make possible?
Oh yeah, I mean, there are plenty of examples right here, and they are in some ways they are reflective in some ways of the character, of the characteristics of digital media and of social media, which is about sharing and about access and about participation, and one of the great virtues is about the ability to provide access and participation to people who historically didn't have it, and so. Or didn't have access to it, or it was too expensive for it, or and so that's one thing. But also, I think what it also does is it puts, because it's able to put people in different relations. Then what it does is it transforms the primacy of physical presence. Which is that that we have to settle it right here in place, and that itself may also be difficult for lots of different kinds of people, and so in that sense, yes, I think that's certainly true. I think what's also true, though, it sounds like but that's not what I mean. So I guess I would say, and I think the other thing that's true is that all of these things also came with a trade. And the trade-off was, we can share, but so can everybody else, and we can participate, but so can advertisers, and we can share, and so can the companies that have all of that data. We can present you with things that you haven't seen before, but so can the algorithms that deliver it to us, or repress it, or suppress it, or organize it. And so I think one of the things that is worth thinking about is exactly what the trade-off was, because I think we're now well into it, and that we've seen, that we're well into it, and we've seen both the really incredible and productive and wonderful and amazing. So I'm certainly not I'm not a dystopian. I don't have a particularly dystopian perspective about media, because I think that's in some ways the cheapest currency that you could spend. But I think that there has to be, a more subtle discussion about what the trade-off was. So there are benefits and there are drawbacks. And I think to try and develop a bit more of a subtle language, I think a language around time is one of those ways, about what the consequences of that trade-off, or of what that trade-off was, and then what the consequences of it was. What did we get in return? And in thinking about what we got in return, I think it's fair to say to take a full accounting, or a fuller accounting, of what those things are.
I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that, or.
I think social media, I mean, so I joined Twitter. I'm not on Twitter anymore. But I joined Twitter right before I Don't Know More happened. I think that was in 2012. And that was exciting. That was a really exciting year. And I didn't live in Ottawa at that time, but I felt like I lived in Ottawa because there was so much happening. And it was really neat because you could connect with through hashtags and things with Indigenous people all over the world even. It was, it was really this global consciousness all of a sudden. Everyone heard about I Don't Know More. And it made you feel like you were part of something big, people were ready for something to change. And I think being able to think globally like that, because Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, no matter where you live, whether you're living on in reserve or in an urban center, I think you can feel lonely or you miss your community. And I think social media has the possibility to, as we've talked about, kind of unite people in a way that makes you feel like you're part of something bigger. And I think the same thing a show like ABADAKONE, you feel like you're part of this bigger message, and you feel that gives you I don't know, momentum, or you feel there's a movement. So I don't know if that's really connected, but
that's good. I'll just remind audience members that if you do have a question, please feel free. Do you want to step up to the mic?
Hello. Thank you so much for the conversation so far. And I want to touch back on what both of you talked about, the synchronicity, and that story about the quill and the great-grandmother, the quill making, that was beautiful. Thank you for that story. And in a similar way, connecting over those different generations with the folding. And I guess I'm interested in when we look at settler Canada and we look at immigrant history, that isn't there so much. It's harder for, I would say, most settlers and to find that folding, or maybe even your first generation off reserve, right? And I think there's because of that and because of a lot of other things, there's a desynchronicity between settler culture and Indigenous culture, because we're obviously separated in space a lot of the time, but separated in time too, in terms of not knowing the history of the place, or in terms of certain things hitting specific communities well before they hit everybody else, right? And I guess the question is, how much are you thinking about the settler perspective when you're making your work or when you're curating the work? And are you interested in bridging that? Are you making it just for your community? Yeah,
that's a great question. Thank you. I talked about this earlier with some folks when we did the walk. I create this for kids and for future generations, and any culture, any kid that walks through this door and sees this work. And kids, they lose their minds when they see bright colors. And for them to see this piece, no matter what their cultural background is, and then to have questions about it, that brings us closer together. Because then kids will speak Mi'kmaq, the title of the piece. I've heard kids say Depgig, kids that are not Mi'kmaq. And it makes me so happy because this word, which has existed since time immemorial in our communities, is now being spoken by everybody. So when I create this work, yes, of course I create it for myself, and I create it for my community and for everyone. And I create it for anybody who wants to come to the gallery and spend time with it. Love it, hate it, whatever your reaction is, I think it's important. That's what artwork does. But for me, it is definitely getting kids young and letting them see this work and enjoy it and have fun with it. a lot of the artwork that I've created in the past, I mean, everything, well, as an Indigenous person, anything that you create as an artist is political. But I have created quite a few political pieces in the past that have been specifically really political. But what I wanted to do with them when I started working with these designs was to create something that looks more at joy. A lot of joy. So I want to create this sense of joy, which is existent and has always existed in our communities. Everyone's communities go up and down in terms of like times of peace and times of war, and times of happiness and times of sorrow. But what I wanted to do with this piece is create something that can instill joy in someone. I always refer to it as an entry point. So no matter what your background is, if your entry point is your favorite color is yellow, and there's yellow in this piece, this is fantastic. And if you see a piece within this, so like a lot of the, right across Turtle Island, there's so many overlaps in our communities. So some of the symbols in Mi'kmaq are the same from in your community in Manitoulin Island. So it's really amazing the conversations that come from that. So when I create these different shapes, someone's like, oh, that looks like Sky Dome from my community, or that looks like a teepee or a wigwam from my community, and this looks like stitching that we do in my community. So, yeah. Long story short, I create it for everyone, but I create it for kids. And I think they're the important ones.
Are there other questions? Yes.
It's a question for Alex, but Jordan, I was intrigued with this presentation of an object in a case that was not really sealed. Mm-hmm. So there's an issue here when we present things in the gallery. Things are in like super sealed cases, and then the minute it's in a case, it's like when it goes in the vault, it looks locked. It looks locked in time. And I think what we learned when we reinstalled the galleries is this notion of living objects that you have mentioned. And Alex, can you talk about, for example, how do we handle the regalia of Jim Hart and the project you want to do about it? Because it involves a lot of things. It involves, regalia that Jim Hart uses regularly. So the case, it becomes empty. So how do you handle that? And then you're talking about traditional technique that's maybe not exist anymore. It's going to take a long time to weave. I mean, and this project has a name, I think I forgot.
Oh,
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you, Serge, for that question. So a couple things. In the galleries, we do have, we talk about works being alive and having a life. There are objects that have like inherent power. So these are works that are living. They're seen as ancestor or elder objects. And then there's other works that seem to have a life, or they have power by virtue of how they've been made, how they've been carried, used. So like a power that's kind of, that they've gained over time. But there's a special kind of category of objects that are alive. So there are a few in the Canadian Indigenous galleries, and these are objects that in order to have them on display, we've had to consult with communities. So there's one object in particular, Kalemtalek, who's a personal fave. I think he's a favorite of a lot of staff at the gallery. And he requires care. So the communities don't want him to lose sight of the days. So they gave us a little blanket that we put on top of his case so Kalemtalek can sleep when the gallery closes for the evening. And then when before the gallery opens to the public, someone takes off the blanket and Kalemtalek wakes up. And so that's, Kalemtalek is alive. The community do view him as an ancestor who's about 5,000 years old. So he's an elder, a really cherished elder. So that's one example, I guess, of how the gallery has really changed. I don't know that it's had a situation like that, or an object like that in the space before, where they've had this daily reminder that if you want to show Indigenous objects, you have to be willing to accept that communities are going to set protocol and cultural protocol for how to care for them. And if we want to display them, we have to commit to doing this cultural work. And then Jim Hart, he's a Haida chief, a hereditary Haida chief from Haida Gwaii in BC, and he loaned us his chiefly regalia. So he's gained he's inherited the rights to wear chiefly regalia. And he loaned it to the gallery with the agreement that he could take it back whenever he needed it for ceremony, and the gallery said, yeah, sure, no problem. And when I first started here at the gallery in 2018, Jim called us and was like, hey, so I have a ceremony coming up in Whistler, and I need my regalia back. And so the gallery, I think, they were like, what do we do? Like, everyone, was looking at me and like, how do we deal with this? What are we going to put in the case? Because if you've seen in the Canadian Indigenous galleries, Jim Hart's regalia is a really central focal point in that case. It's absolutely gorgeous, and we were concerned that if it was gone, because Jim needed it, what were we going to do? So we were thinking about it in meetings. We had a few meetings about it, and we were thinking, do we put another work in there while it's gone? And then we thought it actually because in that case we're talking about the potlatch and the implementation of the potlatch ban in the Indian Act in the 1880s. And what we wanted to show in that case was that despite the potlatch ban, Indigenous people on the Northwest Coast continued to practice the potlatch in secret, and it's still very much alive today. So much so, ceremony is so much alive that Jim Hart needed to take his regalia back to dance it on the West Coast. So we thought this is a great moment to share that with our audience and our visitors, and what better way to show that than it actually not being there. So that was really special. But what came out of that conversation with Jim also, and Lisa, who made a raven's tail robe that's part of his regalia, is they said, well, why don't we make you one? It was a very generous thing that they said that they would do with us, and we partnered with them. And that was really the beginning of what project that we've called the Recreation Project. And we're commissioning contemporary Indigenous artists to create work that's inspired by or in dialogue with historical works. So Lisa Hagwin-Yakjanas, who has work in ABADAKONE, a beautiful raven's tail robe. She's going to be creating a raven's tail robe and an apron and leggings, and Jim Hart's going to be creating a frontlet headdress, a raven rattle, and a staff. And it's extremely meticulous work that they're doing. They are absolute masters in the work that they do. They both are work in historical, customary, traditional techniques. And it'll take them about 2 years to make it. So it's really a special commission for the gallery, and it's also a really important statement too, because it is a commission. So what's really great for me being a curator, every time we get to send money to artists who are doing this kind of revitalization work in community is like a dream. And it's what I live for. I love it. So it is a really important, great project that will be ongoing for the National Gallery, and it's a new focus for acquisitions for us. So so that's a little bit about the project.
Thanks. Well, I've got a question for all three of you, and I guess I'll throw it out to the audience as well. I couldn't resist asking the question, but to me, the gallery that we're in this evening brings objects together from various points in history for audiences to experience today. So I guess in some ways it's a time machine. I haven't really thought about it that way before, but I think it kind of is. How do you imagine people experiencing the gallery's collection 100 years from now?
Hopefully none of the community objects will be here anymore. They'll be back in the communities. They'll be recreated, like they'll be recommissioned, they'll be repatriated and brought back to the places that they should be. That's my goal. I mean, we got 3D printers, man. You could print anything now. Why not do that,
Yeah, or like hologram things.
Hologram them, yeah. The important place, I think, for them is there, but I think... it'll be all these stories, like a lot of the artwork in here. This is going to be artwork that future generations from those people's communities will be looking back at as inspiration. That's really cool. And yeah, it's super exciting to think about that, I think, in a lot of ways. And I was thinking, there was a quote came out I was thinking about earlier, and when I was thinking about my talk, I was thinking about Dr. Leroy Littlebear, and I've had the opportunity to listen to Leroy Littlebear speak, and he's a Blackfoot knowledge keeper, amazing human being, and just he's very generous with his time and his energy and who he shares with and everyone. And his concept of time really struck with me. You know, as Indigenous people, we think about time not as linear, but cyclical in so many ways. And not every community is the same, but it's very similar in a lot of regards. He was saying that in the Blackfoot community, time takes place on a 2-day scale. So there's now, there's yesterday, and there's a day before yesterday. And then there's now, there's tomorrow, and there's a day after tomorrow. So you're always 2 days away from your ancestors. So that means you're always 2 days away from ceremony, from art and teachings. So you're always there, you're always connected. And yeah, it makes me really happy that, like, the raven's tail, like, weavings, like, you know, like, that's just mind-blowing stuff. But to think that those makers are 2 days away from their people who created that, and that my friend Melissa was just 2 days away from her grandmother's quill work. So I hope that that translates into the future 100 years, that we can think of that and be more connected to that as Indigenous people, that we're so close. Even though this concept of time is so vast. We're just a blip, you know, in the grand scheme of it all, but to think that we're so close that we could still get in touch and intact and connect with those things on such a powerful and important way.
Wow. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I can. I'm not sure if I could top that one. No, I mean, I think that museums are, you know, when the museums offer opportunities to. I'm trying to think of how to put it. Museums offer incredible opportunities to revisit, to think temporally, both in terms of to think about time in terms of historical and in terms of historical presences and absences and so on and so forth, but also to think about time artistically, and to think about time as to think about time and temporality, which came up in the French presentation earlier this evening, as an occasion for creative expression, as an inspiration for creative meditation, or for thinking about experience past, but all of the incredible rich language that comes with time, simultaneity, delays, you know, pauses, interstices between time, and all the different kinds of temporal states, boredom, attentiveness, anxiety, sadness, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, so museums are themselves these incredible laboratories, if you will, for thinking about the complexities of time, both in terms of the representative power, in terms of the exhibitions that they use and the ways in which they do it, and the ways in which they refresh, and the ways in which they refresh the ways we think about things, like, you know, what is Canadian art, what is topical, what's important, but also about the ways, and again, like, and I'll just make the point again, which is I really think what they do is that they drive out the incredible ability that artists have to make use of a suite of creative resources to depict time, which is such a perceptual experience and a very intangible experience, and to make them present to us. And I think, you know, I mean, I really can't see that changing in 100 years. I think it's one of the great capacities that museums have.
Do you want to add anything, Alex? You don't have to, no pressure.
I mean, I love, what Jordan was saying about, maybe they'll just be something we almost can't even imagine yet. Like it would, if they can become something that, I think museums and these, institutions kind of have like, a history of like extraction and like taking things and putting them in a, what are some creative and different ways that we can think about them instead of being taking away, can become like generative, and how can that relationship change? And I don't know that we know what that looks like yet. So I think we have to be ready to experiment and maybe fail and be okay with some things maybe failing.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to all three of you. And thanks again to the audience for your really great questions. This is a really wonderful evening. And so, thanks. Big round of applause for our panel.